The 19th century didn't end with progress. It ended with fire. Not one fire, not a dozen fires, but hundreds of synchronized conflagrations that swept through the world's greatest cities within a span of mere decades, reducing architectural masterpieces to ash, erasing municipal records, and conveniently clearing the ground for a new order. Chicago burned in 1871. Boston burned in 1872. London had burned before, but the pattern repeated. Paris burned during the Commune. Moscow had its flames. San Francisco would burn in 1906. But the sequence had already been set. They called them accidents, tragedies, acts of God, or careless mistakes. But when you line up the dates, when you examine the buildings that burned and the ones that survived, when you notice which records vanished and which institutions rose from the ashes, a different picture emerges. These weren't random disasters. They were orchestrated resets, carefully timed erasures of an architectural and technological legacy that didn't fit the narrative being written for the 20th century. Walk through the photographs taken just before the Great Chicago Fire, and you'll see something that doesn't align with the story we've been told. These aren't the rough timber structures of a frontier town barely 40 years old. These are neoclassical palaces, marble facades, ornate cast-iron columns supporting buildings 5 and 6 stories tall, architectural sophistication that supposedly took European cities centuries to achieve. The official history tells us Chicago was incorporated in 1837, a muddy trading post that somehow, in just 3 decades, developed the wealth, skill, and infrastructure to build a city that rivaled Paris. The mathematics don't work. The timeline doesn't work. And then, conveniently, it all burned. 18,000 buildings destroyed in 2 days. The records, the proof, the physical evidence of whatever Chicago actually was before 1871 turned to ash. What rose afterward was a new city, built according to new plans, with a new history written by new powers. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision. Boston's Great Fire of 1872 consumed the commercial heart of the city, 60 acres of the oldest, most historic district, wiping out colonial-era structures and replacing them with modern commercial buildings. The fire started in a warehouse, they said, spread by high winds through wooden structures. But examine the photographs of what burned. Granite buildings, brick structures, metal reinforcements. These weren't tinderboxes. These were fireproof by the standards of their age. Yet they burned with such intensity that the heat cracked stone and melted iron. The fire department, well-equipped and experienced, couldn't stop it. Or perhaps they were told not to. When you study the maps of what burned and what survived, you notice something peculiar. The fire consumed the old merchant districts, the areas where colonial records were kept, where old families held property deeds going back generations. The new financial district, the recently constructed government buildings, those stood untouched. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. The Great Fire of London in 1666 gets taught as historical fact, a tragedy that led to the rebuilding of the city. But examine what that fire accomplished. It erased medieval London, the tangled streets and ancient parishes that held memories of a city far older than official history acknowledged. What replaced it was Christopher Wren's vision, a new London built according to sacred geometry, streets aligned to astronomical positions, churches positioned at specific nodes across the city grid. Wren wasn't just an architect. He was a founding member of the Royal Society, deeply involved in esoteric knowledge, Masonic symbolism, and Hermetic philosophy. The new London wasn't randomly designed. It was a ritual space, a city built according to principles that had nothing to do with commerce or convenience. The fire didn't destroy London. It prepared the ground for transformation. Moscow burned when Napoleon approached in 1812. The Russians claimed they set the fires themselves, a scorched earth strategy to deny the French army supplies. But the fires burned for 6 days, consuming 3/4 of the city, destroying structures that dated back centuries. The Kremlin survived, conveniently, along with certain strategic buildings. Everything else, the merchant quarters, the old boyar estates, the districts where records of pre-Romanov Russia were stored, gone. What Napoleon found wasn't a city, it was a smoking ruin. And what rose afterward was a Moscow rebuilt according to new imperial plans, a city that fit the narrative of Russian imperial power that the Romanovs wanted to project. The old Moscow, whatever it had been, whatever evidence it held of previous civilizations, was erased. The 1871 Paris Commune fires destroyed the Tuileries Palace, the Palais de Justice, the Hôtel de Ville, the Prefecture of Police. They blamed the communards, the revolutionaries, who supposedly set the fires as a final act of defiance. But who benefits when government buildings burn? When centuries of municipal records, property deeds, birth certificates, and historical documents go up in smoke? The fires cleared the ground for the Third Republic, for a new order, for a Paris that would host the great international exhibitions showcasing industrial progress and imperial power. The old Paris, the one that remembered revolutions and upheavals and alternative social experiments, had to be removed first. San Francisco's 1806 earthquake gets the attention, but it was the fire that did the real work. 3,000 acres burned, over 80% of the city destroyed. The official story blames broken gas lines and overwhelmed firefighters, but witnesses reported seeing buildings dynamited by the military, creating fire breaks that just happened to consume the Chinatown district, the old Spanish quarters, the areas where immigrant communities kept records in languages the new American administration couldn't easily control. What rose from the ashes was a sanitized, modern San Francisco, rebuilt according to City Beautiful principles, a planned urban environment that erased the messy multicultural history of the gold rush era. The earthquake was natural. The fire that followed was too convenient, too thorough, too selective in what it destroyed. These fires share common elements beyond their timing. They all occurred in cities that possessed architectural achievements seemingly impossible for their official ages. They all destroyed municipal records, property deeds, birth certificates, the documentary evidence that proves who owned what and who lived where. They all cleared ground for rebuilding according to new urban planning principles, often involving Masonic architects and Beaux-Arts designs, incorporating sacred geometry and esoteric symbolism. And they all happened during a period of intense industrialization and centralization of power, when old mercantile elites were being replaced by new industrial and financial powers that needed clean slates to establish their control. The technology that supposedly didn't exist keeps appearing in the ruins. Chicago's water system before the fire included tunnels under Lake Michigan, pumping stations with capacity far beyond what a city of 300,000 needed. The tunnel boring technology required didn't officially exist until decades later. Boston's underground infrastructure revealed during post-fire reconstruction showed engineering sophistication that couldn't be explained by the city's official history. London's sewers, built after the 1666 fire, demonstrated hydraulic engineering knowledge that supposedly wasn't formalized until the 18th century. These cities weren't primitive settlements that gradually developed. They were built on foundations of something much older, something more advanced, something that had to be buried and forgotten. The architectural style adds another layer to the mystery. Before these fires, cities across the world displayed remarkably similar neoclassical architecture. Massive buildings with columns, domes, and ornamentation that supposedly reflected Greek and Roman inspiration filtered through Renaissance revival. But the Greeks and Romans didn't build with iron frameworks and plate glass windows. They didn't create structures 6 and 7 stories tall with internal heating systems and gas lighting. These weren't revivals. These were continuations. Buildings constructed using inherited techniques from a civilization that actually possessed the technology to build at that scale. The fires destroyed the evidence of that technological continuity, allowing new narratives about architectural history to be written. Narratives that positioned modern industrial civilization as the pinnacle rather than a recovery. The timing of these fires correlates precisely with the consolidation of industrial power and the establishment of central banking systems. The Second Industrial Revolution, the period from 1870 to 1914, saw the creation of monopolies in steel, oil, railroads, and finance. These monopolies required control of urban centers, control of property, control of the physical infrastructure where wealth was generated and stored. Old property claims, ancestral deeds, communal ownership arrangements. These were obstacles. Fire cleared those obstacles. After the flames, new property surveys could be conducted, new ownership records established, new zoning laws implemented. The cities that rose from the ashes were designed for industrial capitalism, laid out for efficiency, for control, for the extraction of wealth upward to centralized financial powers. The world's fairs that followed these fires weren't celebrations of progress. They were demonstrations of the new order. Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition, The White City, appeared just 22 years after the Great Fire, showcasing neoclassical architecture on a scale that supposedly took 6 years to build and was then demolished within months. The temporary nature of these exhibition buildings raises questions. If the technology existed to construct such magnificent structures so quickly, why were they torn down? The official explanation, that they were built from temporary materials, doesn't match the photographs showing solid construction, working fountains, electric lighting systems, and infrastructure that would have cost tens of millions to install just to destroy. These fairs demonstrated what was possible, what already existed in the burned cities, before presenting a narrative of gradual progress and industrial achievement. The photographic record itself presents problems. Daguerreotypes and early photographs from the 1840s and 50s show cities already fully developed, with populations in period dress walking past buildings that appear centuries old. The aging on these structures, the weathering of stone, the patina on metal, these aren't effects from a few decades. They're indicators of age measured in centuries. But according to official timelines, most American cities weren't founded until the late 18th or early 19th centuries. The buildings shouldn't look ancient. They shouldn't show the wear patterns of structures that have stood for hundreds of years. Unless they had. Unless these cities were much older than admitted, built by populations we're not told about, using technologies that don't fit the narrative of gradual industrial development. The fires coincide with another phenomenon: the massive orphan trains and institutional reformations of the late 19th century. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 orphaned or abandoned children were transported from East Coast cities to Western states. The official story presents this as charitable work, relocating urban orphans to farms where they could have better lives. But the numbers are staggering. Where did all these orphans come from? Poverty and disease are offered as explanations, but the scale suggests something more catastrophic. Population records from the period are suspiciously incomplete. Census data shows gaps and inconsistencies, Birth and death certificates often don't exist for the generation born before the Great Fires. It's as if entire populations were displaced, removed, their children redistributed, and their existence erased from official memory. The architectural evidence continues to accumulate despite the fires. Across the world, in cities that didn't burn, similar structures remain. St. Petersburg, never subjected to the systematic fires that struck Western cities, preserves neoclassical architecture on a grand scale, built supposedly during the 18th century by a Russian empire that had been backward and primitive just decades before. The official story claims Peter the Great modernized Russia by importing Western architects and techniques. But the buildings that rose during his reign show technological sophistication that Western Europe didn't officially possess. The bronze horseman statue, cast in 1782, required metallurgical knowledge supposedly not formalized until the 19th century. The St. Isaac's Cathedral, with its massive granite columns transported hundreds of miles and raised into position using techniques that remained mysterious even to 19th century engineers who studied them. The pattern extends beyond Western cities. The Edo period in Japan ended with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, followed by systematic modernization that conveniently required demolishing most of Edo's original structures to build the new Tokyo. Beijing's Forbidden City survived, but much of the surrounding Old City was demolished during the Qing dynasty's final decades and the Republican period that followed. These weren't random urban renewals. They were coordinated efforts to remove physical evidence of previous civilizations, to break the continuity of architectural and technological knowledge, to establish new narratives about who built what and when. The survivors of these fires left accounts that don't match the official stories. Journalists in Chicago reported seeing buildings explode rather than burn. Witnesses describing demolitions that created fire breaks, but also eliminated specific structures. In San Francisco, accounts mention soldiers preventing people from returning to their homes, military cordons that kept residents away, while fires burned through districts that could have been saved. In Paris, the communards accused of starting fires claimed they were trying to stop blazes set by government agents, that the destruction was orchestrated to justify crushing the commune and establishing martial law. These testimonies were dismissed as confusion, hysteria, the unreliable memories of traumatized survivors. But they're consistent. They describe coordination, intentionality, systematic destruction disguised as natural disaster or revolutionary chaos. The insurance industry's role deserves examination. After each major fire, insurance companies collapsed or restructured, claiming inability to pay out on the massive losses. But examine which buildings were insured and which weren't. The structures that burned often had lapsed or inadequate coverage. The ones that survived, particularly government buildings and properties owned by specific banking families, those had been recently reinsured at high values. The pattern suggests foreknowledge. If you knew which districts would burn, you'd make sure your properties were either protected or heavily insured. You'd make sure your competitors' properties weren't. The fires redistributed wealth as efficiently as they redistributed property ownership. The official explanations become increasingly strained when examined collectively. Chicago's fire supposedly started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. That story was later admitted to be fabricated, made up by a journalist. But it remained in textbooks for generations because it provided a simple, memorable explanation that prevented deeper investigation. Boston's fire started in a warehouse, cause unknown. San Francisco's fire resulted from earthquake damage to gas lines. Paris burned during revolutionary chaos. Each explanation, taken individually, sounds plausible. Viewed together, they form a pattern of convenient accidents that all achieve the same result: erasing the old, clearing ground for the new, eliminating evidence, and consolidating control. The speed of reconstruction adds another impossibility. Chicago's downtown, 18,000 buildings destroyed, was substantially rebuilt within 3 years. The labor force required, the materials needed, the coordination of thousands of construction projects happening simultaneously. This represents organizational capacity that supposedly didn't exist. Where did the workers come from? Where were the materials sourced? How were so many buildings designed so quickly? The official narrative suggests that disaster sparked innovation, that necessity drove efficiency. But the more likely explanation is that the capacity already existed, that the construction techniques were already known, that the designs were already prepared, waiting for the ground to be cleared. The underground cities present the final piece of evidence. Beneath Seattle, beneath Portland, beneath many cities that burned, there exist entire street levels now buried. The official explanation calls them underground tours, remnants of cities that raised their street levels after fires or floods. But walk through these buried districts, and you'll see intact storefronts, sidewalks, building facades, complete infrastructure not at ground level but 15-20 feet below the current surface. These weren't basements. They were street levels, deliberately buried, covered over, hidden from view. The cities didn't raise their streets. They built new cities on top of old ones, using the fires as justification for the burial. Seattle's underground formed after the 1889 fire that destroyed the downtown core. The official story says the city rebuilt at a higher elevation to improve drainage and prevent flooding. But the buried city below shows no evidence of flood damage. It shows evidence of intentional burial, of vaulting over existing structures, of creating a new surface while preserving what lay beneath, locked away from public access. Portland's Shanghai tunnels, San Francisco's buried districts, Chicago's freight tunnels that connect to deeper, older passageways. All these suggest layered cities, civilizations built atop civilizations, with each new layer requiring a reset event, a fire or disaster that justifies covering the old. The technology of the burned cities appears in other contexts, disguised as new inventions. The Crystal Palace, built for London's 1851 Great Exhibition, showcased iron and glass construction techniques supposedly innovative for the period. But similar structures appear in photographs from decades earlier, in cities that would later burn. The technology wasn't new. It was being reintroduced, repackaged as modern innovation when it was actually inherited technique. The incandescent light bulb, patented by Edison in 1879, appears in photographs from the 1860s in European cities, already lighting streets and buildings. The telephone, the phonograph, the electrical systems, all these supposedly revolutionary inventions of the late 19th century show evidence of earlier development, earlier deployment, earlier knowledge that was suppressed and then reintroduced through official channels controlled by industrial monopolies. The banking families that financed the reconstruction of burned cities were the same families that controlled the central banks being established during this period. The Rothschilds financed the rebuilding of Paris. The Morgans and Vanderbilts controlled the railroads and steel that rebuilt Chicago. The San Francisco reconstruction was orchestrated by banking interests that would later establish the Federal Reserve. These weren't independent local disasters followed by organic recovery. These were centrally coordinated transformations, using disaster as cover for the consolidation of financial control, the establishment of new property systems, and the erasure of alternative histories that might challenge the narratives being written by the victors. The ritual aspects cannot be ignored. Many of these fires occurred during significant astrological periods, during conjunctions and alignments that esoteric traditions consider powerful for magical workings. The architecture that replaced the burned cities incorporated sacred geometry, buildings positioned at specific coordinates, street plans aligned to celestial patterns, monuments placed at power nodes within urban grids. This wasn't random city planning. This was intentional sacred architecture. Cities designed as ritual spaces, as instruments for channeling and controlling energy, built according to principles that secret societies have preserved for millennia. The fires weren't just about erasing evidence. They were about preparing ground for ritual transformation, for the establishment of urban spaces designed to specific metaphysical principles. The universities and libraries that survived the fires, or were rebuilt immediately after, became the authorized keepers of knowledge, the institutions that would decide what history was taught, what technologies were developed, what narratives were promoted. Harvard survived Boston's fire. The University of Chicago was founded in 1890, less than 20 years after the Great Fire. Funded by Rockefeller money, specifically to shape education in the rebuilt city. These institutions weren't neutral academic centers. They were ideological control points, places where the new history would be written, where the next generation would be taught what to believe about the past. The old universities, the ones that might have preserved alternative knowledge, those had conveniently lost their libraries, their archives, their evidence in the flames. The 19th century's great fires accomplished what wars and revolutions couldn't. They erased physical evidence of previous civilizations, broke cultural continuity, redistributed property and wealth, established centralized control over rebuilt cities, and created a tabula rasa upon which a new history could be written. The official explanations, each individually plausible, collectively form an impossible coincidence. Too many fires, too perfectly timed, too thoroughly destructive, too conveniently followed by reconstruction that served specific interests. The architectural evidence suggests these burned cities were far older and more sophisticated than admitted. The technological evidence indicates knowledge that supposedly didn't exist. The financial evidence shows coordination and foreknowledge. The ritual evidence reveals intentional sacred design in the rebuilt cities. They called it the Great Fire, singular, as if Chicago stood alone. But it wasn't singular. It was systematic. It was the 19th century's Great Reset, a coordinated erasure of an architectural and technological legacy that would have challenged the entire narrative of human history we've been taught to accept. The cities that burned weren't young frontier towns or medieval fire traps. They were sophisticated urban centers built by civilizations we're not told about, using technologies we're told didn't exist, preserving knowledge that had to be buried for the 20th century's narrative to work. The fires were necessary, not natural, not accidental, but necessary for the establishment of the industrial order, the centralization of power, and the control of human consciousness through the control of history itself. What burned in the 19th century wasn't just buildings. It was evidence. It was proof. It was the physical reality that would have revealed the lie at the heart of modern civilization's origin story. And now, walking through our modern cities, we walk through crime scenes, rebuilt monuments to a great forgetting, where every skyscraper stands on foundations we're not allowed to question, and every official history is written in ash.